Welcome to the Behind Story, where the wildest Karen encounters come to life. Get ready for jaw-dropping, hilarious, and downright unbelievable moments as Karens take entitlement to the next level. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a crazy story. Let's jump right in. A quiet neighborhood. A home standing apart from the rest. A man who had lived peacefully for years, content in his own slice of independence, until one morning when everything changed. The envelope was plain, no return address, just a stark, bold stamp across the front. Urgent. He found it lying on his doorstep, nestled against the morning newspaper, an ominous presence against the backdrop of his daily routine. He didn't rush to open it. The man, let's call him Jack, had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. But the moment he unfolded the letter, he felt the first flicker of something dark curling at the edges of his tranquility. A violation notice. Jack's brow furrowed as he read. Words like unauthorized alterations, non-compliant landscaping, and immediate corrective action required jumped out at him. His mailbox was apparently too tall. His driveway paint didn't conform to community standards. Even his grass height off by less than an inch was now deemed unacceptable. The message was clear. He had broken the rules, but there was a problem, a major one. Jack wasn't part of any HOA, never had been, never agreed to their terms. His property had stood on this land long before the Homeowners Association had even existed, and he had made sure legally, contractually, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that their reach ended at his fence line. This letter, this demand, it had no power over him, and yet here it was, nestled against his morning paper like a snake in the grass. Jack exhaled slowly, then, without a word, crumpled the paper in his fist. It landed in the recycling bin with a soft thunk. A misunderstanding, surely. A clerical error, nothing worth losing sleep over. He grabbed his coffee, settled onto his porch, and let the morning sun warm his face. But peace was short-lived. That afternoon, a sharp knock rattled his front door. The sound was precise, practiced authoritative. Jack took his time answering, not out of hesitation, but because he already knew, deep down, that whoever stood on the other side wasn't here for a friendly chat. She was in her late 50s, pressed into a blazer that was a little too stiff for the mild weather. A name badge glinted on her lapel. HOA board member. Her expression held no warmth, only the rigid confidence of someone who had long grown used to people obeying without question. I assume you received our notice. Jack leaned against the doorframe, arms crossing lazily over his chest. I did. Her lips pressed into a thin smile, the kind that barely masked irritation. Then I assume you understand the importance of compliance. Jack chuckled, low and easy. No, what I understand is that your authority ends where my property begins. For the first time, something flickered across her face. Annoyance, a sliver of doubt, but it was gone in an instant. That's not entirely correct, she said smoothly, reaching into the leather folder tucked under her arm. This neighborhood follows HOA guidelines. There are no exceptions. Jack didn't reach for the paper she was about to present. He didn't need to. He already knew the truth. Then I guess we have a problem, he said, a slow grin curling at the corner of his lips. Because if they thought they could strong-arm him, they had no idea what they were up against. The first shot had been fired, but Jack barely felt the sting. As far as he was concerned, the HOA had no real power over him. They could huff and puff, but they had no legal grounds to force him into compliance. He expected the whole thing to fizzle out a bureaucratic blunder that would vanish once they realized their mistake. But Jack had underestimated them. The next morning, a bright orange notice was taped to his front door, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It was larger, bolder, and far more aggressive than the first letter. This time, the accusations were even more absurd. Grass height exceeds community standards by 0.75 inches. Mailbox is not in uniform compliance with HOA aesthetic guidelines. Vehicle parked in driveway is an eyesore and disrupts neighborhood harmony. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and legal intervention. Jack let out a slow whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Escalating fines? They weren't just sending empty threats anymore, they were doubling down, hoping intimidation would wear him down. They were going to be disappointed. He crumpled the notice and tossed it into the trash without a second thought. If they wanted to play games, he was more than happy to watch them lose. That afternoon, Jack noticed a small gathering forming across the street. 3 people, 2 men, and the same woman who had shown up at his door the day before, stood in a tight huddle, their eyes darting toward his house in quick, measuring glances. Their postures were stiff, their whispers hurried, and even from his porch, Jack could sense the self-importance radiating from them like heat off asphalt. Then, a landscaping truck rumbled up the street and came to a stop in front of his house. Jack straightened. A man in a neon vest stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the yard before landing on Jack. He hesitated, looking from Jack to the HOA enforcers, then back again, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. Jack took his time getting up, rolling his shoulders before strolling down the driveway. "Something I can help you with?" The landscaper shifted awkwardly. We were called out to trim your yard to HOA standards." Jack let out a slow chuckle, folding his arms. "That's funny, because I didn't call anyone." Before the worker could respond, the HOA woman stepped in. Her tone clipped. "We took the liberty of hiring landscapers for you, since you refuse to maintain your property to code. The cost will be added to your outstanding fines." Jack arched a brow, amusement sparking in his chest. "Outstanding fines?" He leaned forward slightly. "Lady, I don't have outstanding fines, because I'm not in your HOA." Her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. "You live in this neighborhood. That means you're subject to HOA regulations." "Wrong," Jack said easily. "My property predates your little club. I have legal documents proving I'm not under your jurisdiction." The landscaper blinked, clearly realizing he was caught in the middle of something way above his pay grade. I think I'll just head out." Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel, climbed back into his truck, and drove off. The HOA woman's face turned red with anger. "You can't just ignore the rules." Jack grinned. "I absolutely can." For a long moment she just stood there, rage bubbling under the surface. But Jack could see it now, that small, creeping doubt. She hadn't expected him to push back. She hadn't expected resistance at all. She took a breath, gathering herself. "You think you're above the law?" Jack's smile widened. "No, I just think you have no idea how the law works." She stormed off, muttering something under her breath as her 2 cronies followed close behind, throwing dirty looks over their shoulders. Jack watched them go, his grin never fading. But within the hour, a fresh HOA letter was stuffed into his mailbox, this one stamped with final warning in aggressive red ink. That evening, the neighborhood was buzzing. People whispered on sidewalks, stole glances at Jack's house. Some neighbors seemed amused, entertained by the battle unfolding in their quiet community. Others were more cautious, uneasy about being caught in the crossfire. And then there were the HOA loyalists, those who averted their eyes when Jack walked by, murmuring under their breath, like he was some kind of troublemaker. Jack didn't care. But the HOA, they weren't done. They were about to take things to an entirely new level. The morning air was crisp, but Jack could feel the weight of tension hanging over his property like a storm cloud ready to burst. It had been days since his last encounter with the HOA, and while their threats had been getting bolder, he hadn't expected what came next. It started with a sound, a sharp knock at the door. Not the polite kind, the kind that meant business, the kind that sent a clear message: "We're not asking." Jack exhaled slowly, setting down his coffee before making his way to the door. He already had a feeling about who it was, but when he swung it open, he found something even more ridiculous than he had imagined. Two police officers. Standing just behind them, arms folded with a smug look of victory plastered across her face, was the HOA woman. Jack didn't even need to hear the first words to know exactly what was happening. "Sir," the first officer said, his voice steady but laced with mild irritation, "we received a complaint from the Homeowners Association regarding a dispute over property regulations." Jack ran a hand down his face, a slow, exasperated sigh escaping his lips. "You've got to be kidding me." The HOA woman didn't even try to hide her smirk. Jack could almost hear what was running through her head. Checkmate. But this wasn't her victory. Not even close. The second officer, a slightly older man with sharp eyes, glanced between Jack and the HOA rep before asking, "Are you refusing to comply with the HOA's rules?" Jack crossed his arms. "I'm not in the HOA." The first officer exchanged a look with his partner before turning to the HOA woman. "Ma'am, is he actually a part of your association?" She stiffened, her face betraying the first sign of unease. "He lives in this neighborhood," she snapped. "That means he's under our guidelines." Jack almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he stepped back inside, reached for a folder on his kitchen counter, and returned to the door. He held it out to the officers. "Knock yourselves out." The older officer flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. The only sound was the faint rustling of paper as he examined every document, every legal exemption Jack had meticulously prepared. Then, after a long pause, he closed the folder and handed it back. "Looks like you're right," he said simply. The HOA woman paled. "What?" The first officer shifted his weight. "Ma'am, unless he's breaking an actual law, there's nothing we can do." Her mouth opened and closed, the color rising in her cheeks. He still has to comply with community standards." The older officer gave her a long, unamused look. "No, ma'am. Legally, he doesn't." Jack leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her unravel. It was beautiful. But this is ridiculous," she stammered, her voice rising. "We can't have people just ignoring the rules." The officer sighed. He was done with this conversation. "Unless you want to file an actual police report for something criminal, we're finished here." Jack tilted his head slightly, feigning curiosity. "Would you like to file a report? Maybe tell them about how you keep trespassing on my property? Because I can assure you, that is illegal." Her jaw clenched so tightly that Jack half expected her teeth to crack. The officers didn't wait for her to respond. They gave Jack a nod, clearly relieved to be done with whatever nonsense they'd just walked into, and headed back to their squad car. As they pulled away, the HOA woman stood there, fists clenched, fury radiating off her in waves. Jack grinned. "Well, that was embarrassing for you." Her glare could have melted steel. She took a step forward, voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "This isn't over." Jack's grin widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." He closed the door in her face. Jack knew one thing for certain: HOA Karen wasn't going to back down. The way she had stood on his porch, fists clenched, face red with fury as the cops drove away, that wasn't defeat. That was a promise. A promise that she would come back, that she would escalate, and Jack was more than ready. The next morning, he woke up to a violation sign planted squarely in his front yard, bright yellow, obnoxious, and stamped with the HOA's ridiculous demands. A second letter, just as aggressive as the last, was stuffed into his mailbox, despite the fact that tampering with mail was a federal offense. Jack sighed, took his time making a cup of coffee, then strolled outside in his robe, plucked the sign from the ground, and examined it like it was a rare, bizarre artifact. Then, with the same casual energy, he walked it straight over to the HOA president's house and planted it in her front lawn. For good measure, he snapped a picture and posted it in the neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, Looks like I'm not the only one violating these sacred community standards. The reaction was instant. The comments section exploded. Some neighbors, those who had secretly despised the HOA for years, loved it. Others, the die-hard HOA loyalists, were outraged. And then, not even an hour later, HOA Karen was back. This time, she wasn't alone. Two other board members flanked her, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen, on the other hand, was seething. "You think this is funny?" she snapped, waving her phone in the air. Jack could see his post glaring back at him on the screen. Jack smirked. "Oh, I don't think it's funny. I think it's hilarious." Her face turned a shade of red that almost concerned him. "Almost. You're mocking the rules that keep this neighborhood in order," she spat. "No," Jack said, arms crossed. "I'm mocking the ridiculous idea that you think you can enforce them on me." The balding man standing next to her, clearly regretting his life choices, cleared his throat. "Let's just keep this civil. The fact remains that your property is not in line with the HOA's expectations." Jack let out a low chuckle. "And the fact remains that I don't care." Karen's eyes burned. "If you don't comply, we'll take legal action." "Oh, please do," Jack said, leaning against his doorway. "I'd love to see you explain to a judge why you think you have authority over a house that's legally not part of your HOA." For a split second, Karen faltered. Doubt crept in. But she recovered fast, shoulders squared, her voice dripping with manufactured confidence. "You'll see." And with that, she and her board members stormed off. Jack watched them go, shaking his head with amusement. But this wasn't over. Not even close. The next few days were pure chaos. The HOA, now desperate, switched tactics. They started playing dirty. Jack's trash bins disappeared on collection day, only to mysteriously reappear several blocks away. His sprinklers stopped working, and when he checked, someone had tampered with the system. And then came the complaints. Noise violations, eyesore reports, all filed against him, all false. Jack didn't even have to be home for them to make up some nonsense. He had been out of town for 3 days when one of the reports was filed, but then they made their biggest mistake. A contractor showed up at his house, claiming he'd been hired by the HOA to fix violations. The kicker? The bill would be charged to Jack's own address. Jack exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to laugh in disbelief. Instead, he locked eyes with the man standing on his porch, clipboard in hand. "I didn't hire you," Jack said, voice calm. The contractor sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, figured as much. These HOA types pull this stunt all the time." Jack's jaw tightened. He had been playing nice, letting them dig their own graves. But now it was time to end this. He spent the next 24 hours preparing. First, he gathered every single document proving his legal exemption from the HOA. Then he reached out to a lawyer, and finally he started digging. The HOA loved enforcing their rules on everyone else. But Jack had a hunch, one that turned out to be right. The HOA president, she had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. The VP built a backyard deck without permits. The head of enforcement, his own lawn was out of compliance with the HOA's landscaping rules. Jack didn't have to do anything illegal. He simply let the neighborhood know. He started leaking information, posting screenshots of public records in the group chat, asking questions. And just like that, the tides turned. The once untouchable HOA was on the defensive. Neighbors started filing their own complaints. Some even stopped paying their dues in protest, demanded transparency. Karen? She was furious. But she was also powerless, because for the first time ever, the HOA wasn't in control. Jack had seen people backpedal before, but nothing compared to the sheer desperation now radiating from the HOA. The once smug board members were scrambling, frantic emails flooding the neighborhood group, urging residents to remain calm and united. But it was too late. The neighborhood was turning on them. For years, people had lived in quiet fear of the HOA's iron grip, swallowing unfair fines and ridiculous regulations just to avoid confrontation. But now, they realized the emperor had no clothes. And Jack had been the one to expose it all. The morning after Jack leaked the financial discrepancies and rule violations of the HOA board, chaos erupted. Residents, the ones who had been fined, harassed, and threatened for years, started fighting back. Complaints flooded the city council. People demanded audits, transparency, even resignations. The HOA, now drowning in public backlash, made their biggest mistake yet. A summons arrived in Jack's mailbox. They were suing him. The document was laughable, a last-ditch attempt at intimidation. Buried in legal jargon, it accused him of disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood, repeated defiance of HOA authority, inciting discord among residents. Jack read it once, then burst out laughing. They had nothing, no legal standing, no legitimate claim. But they had just made a fatal mistake. They brought this fight into a courtroom. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread, and half the neighborhood had shown up just to witness the HOA's impending downfall. On one side sat Karen and her remaining board members, stiff as statues. Their attorney, looking like a man who regretted taking this case, flipped through his notes with visible exhaustion. On the other side, Jack, calm, confident, and holding a stack of legal documents that were about to end this nonsense once and for all. The HOA's lawyer was the first to speak. He droned on about community expectations, mandatory compliance, and preserving property values. Then the judge leaned forward. One simple question: is his property legally under your HOA's jurisdiction? A long, painful pause. Karen cleared her throat. Well, it's within the neighborhood. The judge raised an unimpressed brow. Yes or no? The HOA attorney sighed, rubbing his temples. No, Your Honor. And just like that, the case was over. Jack could have left it there, could have walked out of that courtroom victorious, knowing they had just humiliated themselves in front of half the town. But why stop there? He stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to file a counterclaim. The room stilled. Karen visibly stiffened. The HOA attorney's head snapped up. On what grounds? The judge asked, curious. Jack placed his stack of papers on the table. One by one, he laid out the evidence. Harassment, repeated trespassing, tampering with personal property, illegal fines, misuse of HOA funds. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Jack flipped through email correspondences, unauthorized charges, even video footage of HOA members trespassing on his land. The judge took a long, slow breath before turning to the HOA attorney. Do you have a response to this? Silence. Karen looked like she might faint. The ruling was swift. The HOA was found guilty of harassment and illegal enforcement. Jack was awarded damages. The HOA was ordered to cease all contact with him immediately. And the final blow? An official investigation was launched into the HOA's financial records. Every mismanaged dollar, every fraudulent expense, it was all going under the microscope. Jack walked out of the courtroom a free man. Karen? She walked out a ruined woman. The fallout was immediate. Within weeks, the HOA crumbled. Board members resigned in disgrace. Neighbors demanded refunds for their absurdly high fees. Some stopped paying entirely. And Jack? Jack threw a massive backyard barbecue. The once feared enforcers of the HOA were now nothing more than a cautionary tale. And across the street, watching it all unfold, was Karen, packing up her house, leaving, for good. Jack raised his drink in a mock toast as she pulled out of the driveway, her face twisted in bitter defeat. Justice served, karma delivered, and as Jack sat back in his chair, watching his neighborhood finally breathe, he let out a slow, satisfied sigh. Life was good. It was over. Not just the lawsuit, not just the petty citations and threats. The HOA itself was dead. Jack could feel it in the air, in the way people carried themselves through the neighborhood. It was like someone had lifted a decades-old weight off their backs. For years, the HOA had ruled with fear fines for leaving a trash can out too long, warnings for painting a door the wrong shade of beige, threats of legal action over invisible infractions. But that era was gone. Jack had seen to it. The final blow came in the form of an official city letter. Jack found it in his mailbox one morning, a crisp envelope stamped with the city's official seal. Inside, a simple declaration: due to legal violations and the misuse of funds, the Homeowners Association governing your neighborhood has been formally dissolved. Effective immediately, all HOA regulations are null and void. Jack read it twice, then a third time. Then he laughed, loud, long, and unrestrained. Karen had lost, completely. The news spread fast. By noon, the neighborhood was practically celebrating in the streets. People who had once lived in fear of citations and fines were now openly defying every ridiculous rule the HOA had enforced. The guy who had been fined for his unauthorized flower bed dug up his entire front lawn and planted a massive, colorful garden. The family who had been told their driveway basketball hoop violated aesthetic harmony installed two more. Someone even strung up Christmas lights in broad daylight, despite it being the middle of summer, just because they finally could. The neighborhood had been freed, and it was glorious. And Jack? He threw the biggest barbecue the neighborhood had ever seen. Smoke curled into the evening sky as laughter and conversation filled the air. Jack stood by the grill, flipping burgers, watching as neighbors, people who had barely spoken to each other before, came together like an actual community. It was no longer a place of whispered complaints and passive-aggressive warning letters. It was a neighborhood again, a real one. Frank, the retired vet from down the street, clapped Jack on the back, chuckling as he took a swig of beer. "You did it, kid." Jack smirked. "We all did." Across the street, a moving truck sat in Karen's driveway. Jack watched as she hauled boxes into the back of it, her movements stiff, her face set in a mask of bitter defeat. Once the most feared woman in the neighborhood, now just another disgraced bureaucrat packing up and running away. She caught him watching. For a moment, Jack thought she might say something, one last desperate attempt at reclaiming some kind of dignity. But no, she just turned away, shoulders slumping as she disappeared into the cab of the truck. Jack raised his drink in a mock toast. Good riddance. Weeks passed. The HOA remained nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered among the remaining board members, those who hadn't already fled. And the neighborhood? It thrived. Without the oppressive rules, without the constant harassment, people actually enjoyed living there again. It was no longer a place where someone feared receiving a notice over the height of their grass. It was home. Jack sat on his porch one evening, sipping a cold beer as he watched kids ride bikes freely down the street, neighbors chatting without fear of an HOA snitch lurking nearby. For the first time in years, the place finally felt right. And as he leaned back, stretching out, feeling the cool evening breeze against his skin, he smiled. Life was good. The dust had settled. The HOA was gone. The neighborhood had reclaimed its freedom. But this wasn't just about one man defying a petty, power-hungry board. This was about something bigger. Jack had seen it firsthand what happens when people allow fear to dictate their lives. For years, the HOA had operated unchecked, wielding power not because they were right, but because no one had dared to challenge them.